In this video, we're going to take a closer look at event handling in Vue, focusing specifically on the v-on directive, which we've already seen an example in our Flashware demo so far. So let's take a moment to review that. All right, where we saw this used was within our check answer button. We have the v-on directive here. And with this, we learned that some directives take arguments, which is just some value you're going to put after the directive following a colon. In the case of v-on, the arguments we can give it are any DOM event, such as click, change, if we want to listen for some change to an element. Let's say we had like a dropdown and we wanted to do something when that dropdown was changed, we could do that. We can also listen for mouse events, things like mouse over, mouse out. And also we can listen for keyboard events, which we'll see an example of in a moment. As for the value that we specify for the v-on directive, it's going to be just some JavaScript expression that we want to execute. And the way we last left this example is we were using a method handler. So the expression we wanted to execute was just executing a method that we had defined within our Vue instance options. And this made sense because there were two things we needed to do in response to this click. So offloading that over to methods over here just gave us more room to work with this code. But as we saw before we got to the method, we could also handle this via an inline handler where we directly wrote the expression in our template. And what that looked like is we had something like this. We set our correct data property to be the result of comparing word B and whatever the answer was. And then we expanded on that. We also needed to change our show feedback data property. We needed to set that to true when this button was clicked. All right, so that's an example of an inline handler. You just throw the JavaScript directly within your template. Now, in seeing these two different approaches, we also talked about how when you're referencing your data properties as part of these expressions, if you're working inline in the template here, you could just directly reference those data properties. Whereas if you're working within a method, you needed to prefix each of those data properties with the special keyword this. All right, and the reason we talked about that or why this is because within this context, when we're working within methods, if we don't specify this, it's going to see these properties as just local variables. We have to explicitly indicate that we're talking about properties of this instance. That's where the this keyword comes into play. Whereas our template, not necessary. We don't have to prefix them with this just because of how the template is processed by Vue. Basically makes all of our data properties accessible directly. And with that, that recaps everything we know about the v-on directive so far. So let's dig into some additional details to know about event handling. And for the next detail, let me actually revert this back. I do want to invoke our check answer method again. And what I want to show is how we can access meta information about the event that's being triggered. The way we will do this is we will pass a special parameter to our methods called event, and we're just going to prefix that with a $sign. And then within the method itself, we will set up a parameter to receive that information. And just to show what this is going to get us, I'm just going to log to the console what event is. So let me pull this up in the browser. It doesn't really matter what I enter at this point, but I'm going to click the button. That's going to be our event. And here's what we're looking at down in the console. Let me zoom in on this. This is the meta information about the event itself. So in this case, we're dealing with a click. So in the world of the browser API, this is referred to as a pointer event. And you can see we have all this information about it, including things like what was the XY coordinate of the mouse when we actually click the button. Lots of other details within here. Now, this sort of information for this example of clicking a button, we don't really need this, but you can imagine how this might be useful in other situations. Let's say we were building like a really interactive game where, we were trying to click on some target on the page and we wanted to give the user feedback as to whether they were hitting that target. Being able to access things like the XY coordinates of the mouse could be useful for that. Now, obviously not applicable to our Flashware demo, but useful to just tuck away in the back of our head if we ever needed that meta information. Moving on, another event handling technique I want to take a look at is the use of modifiers. And the way I want to demonstrate modifiers is I want to rewind back to our text input here, and I want to make it so that after we enter an answer, if the user hits the enter key, we want that to also trigger our check answer method. To set this up, we'll use the v-on directive again. And then this time the event we're going to listen for, instead of click, we're going to listen for the key up event. And then here's where modifiers come in. Following that, we're going to say period, some modifier And in this case, our modifier is going to be what key we actually want to listen for. So in this case, it's going to be enter. And then we'll just specify what we want to happen, which again, I just wanted to also trigger our check answer method. And let's clean that method up. We don't actually need the event anymore, so I'm going to get rid of that. All right, and let's test this out. So we should be able to check our answer either via hitting enter or clicking the button. So I'll enter an answer, hit enter, and perfect. And that's the most typical modifier you're going to use when working with an event listener like KeyUp. But you can listen for other keyboard keys as well, things like the shift key, your control key, etc. And as a point of reference for this, let me go back to the notes. And I'm going to go down to this section we're talking about now, modifiers. I do have a link here over to the Mozilla Developer Network where they talk about all the possible keyboard events that we could be listening for. And the thing to understand about those events when we're using them in this Vue context as these modifiers is we just need to make a case convention switch. So in the official docs, you'll see this upper camel case styling being used. And when we're using those events as modifiers within our Vue context, we just need to switch to this lower kebab case styling. And just as an example of this, let's just go over to the docs and find a key event we want to work with. For example, I'm just going to search for our arrow key events. All right, so let's say we wanted to do something in response to the user pressing the down arrow. We're told here that it's arrow down. So coming back to our code, the way we would use this is instead of writing arrow down, we would just convert it to all lowercase and we would separate the two words with a dash. Now, I don't know why we would actually want to do that in this context, but I did just want to show that. But I'm going to revert this back to the enter key. So those are the details on listening for specific keys via a modifier. And I should mention, we will see other examples of modifiers when working with Vue. So just to break down the anatomy of how we're working with these directives, we have the directive itself. Potentially, we sometimes have an argument, not always, right? With vModel, we didn't have an argument. And then in addition to the argument itself, we may further customize how this is working by adding a modifier. And finally, somewhat related to this whole idea of the architecture of our directives, some of our directives also have shortcuts. Specifically for our directives that we use frequently, things like event listeners, we can abbreviate this with a @. And we could do this for any of our vOn directives. And it's just a syntax shortcut, just because directives like vOn, you will find yourself using them a lot throughout your templates. In this series and in my code, I tend to stick with the full vOn directive just because it's less cognitive overload as you're looking through your code. I like it to be a little bit more expressive, a little bit more explicit. But by all means, go with whatever style you prefer. My main recommendation would be just be consistent, right? So if you're going to use the shortcut, always use it. Don't switch back and forth between using it and not using it. It's just going to make your code harder to think through as you're reading through it. To wrap up this discussion of event handling, I want to talk about something that stood out to me when I was first learning Vue. And it goes back to how we're invoking JavaScript, whether it be expressions or methods, in line with our HTML templates. At first, this seemed really counterintuitive to me because the way that I was taught JavaScript is it was very important to have separation of concerns between your HTML and your JavaScript. And as an example of this, let me actually go back to the notes. I talk about this at the very end, this idea of a shift in convention. And here I have an example of a button with a regular on-click attribute. This is just not Vue specific. It is just part of what we have access in the browser API. And we can use it to invoke JavaScript. But like I said, when I was learning JavaScript, I was taught that this was bad. Instead, what we would do is in our, say, external JavaScript file, we would access the button via the DOM and attach an event listener to it. And then we could specify what we wanted to happen. Right. And the idea with this was separation of concerns so that we weren't mixing JavaScript with our HTML. So if you also came to learn JavaScript under this school of approach, just seeing the use of the vOn directive in Vue might seem wrong. But the reason we're seeing a shift kind of back towards this inline style is, remember, we talked about how with Vue frameworks, we're moving towards a more declarative style of programming. And with that, we are avoiding having to interact directly with the DOM from our JavaScript, right? So statements like this, where we target something in the DOM and do something to it, is not something we should be doing in a Vue framework. All right, so we don't have this option. And then, our best alternative then is to directly specify what JavaScript should be executed from the element itself. And I still think it's okay in terms of separation of concerns, especially if you are taking advantage of methods, right? Because the core of the JavaScript, when you're using methods, is actually happening in your JavaScript file in that method. I think if you're trying to do everything via inline handlers and expressions, then yeah, that's going to get a little messy in terms of mixing your HTML and JavaScript, but it doesn't have to be that way because we do have access to methods. And then the other nice thing about this is, if you think about it, is when you're looking through your HTML template, you really have a much more complete picture of what's going on, because the way we did things previously, you could have click listeners attached to buttons, but you had no way of knowing that when you were actually looking at your HTML template and your HTML code. Whereas in the world of Vue, using the v on directive is just much clearer, scanning through our templates to understand what is happening with these elements and what is the connection with the data and also the actions of our application. So it is a shift in convention, but I think it's one of those that once you get used to it, you come to appreciate it. And we'll see this a couple more times, this sort of going against the grain when it comes to working with frameworks. And we'll talk about that when that comes up, and talk about the pros and cons and merits of different approaches to things. All right, but that's all I have to say in this video about event handling with the v on directive. In the next part of the series, we're going to take a look at attribute binding.